immediately thereafter arrested, who was immediately offered a position or a spot at Boston University's master's program after he'd been told that if he didn't quit Vanderbilt, he would never ever find a position. He had many offers for a position. Who was called by the Nashville students on Mother's Day, 1961, the day of the Anniston bombing and the slaughter in Birmingham. Who did they call to see whether continuing the Freedom Riders was the right thing to do? And he said, absolutely. Who was the one who came to Montgomery to get on the Freedom Ride bus to Jackson, Mass, and to jail and to Parchman Prison? Who was the one who gave an impromptu news conference at the border when they crossed into Mississippi saying they didn't want any soldiers on their bus. They didn't want any police protection. All they wanted was to travel through the South as Americans. Who was often asked by Martin Luther King to teach workshops, and when he did, Martin Luther King always sat in the center front row. Who would move to the South, to Nashville, at the invitation of Martin Luther King in the fall of 1956 at Oberlin College, who had insisted that he come south right now, even though he said it would be 5 years after his education was completed. Please don't delay, come as quickly as you can. Who was this teacher of the leaders of the youth of the Civil Rights Movement and the peer of Martin Luther King? It's James Morris Lawson, Jr. He is the grandson or great-grandson of a slave who escaped under the Underground Railroad to Canada. His father was one of the first black graduates of McGill University, and whose father came to the U.S. as a Methodist Zionist minister, itinerant preacher in Massachusetts and upstate New York. He went to college, Baldwin Wallace, a United Methodist School in Berea, Ohio, 2,000 students, 60 of whom were black. He read a lot about Gandhi and admired him. He joined the Fellowship of Reconciliation in his freshman year in 1947, which was the year that organization had the first Freedom Ride in the South, remember, in the Upper South that we heard about. Decided in 1950 that he could not serve in the armed forces. He believed in nonviolence from his mother primarily. He had three deferments that he could take advantage of: conscientious objector, minister, and a student, college student, or a graduate student at the time. He refused all three. He was tried in April of 1951. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. He went to prison. First he went here. This is in West Virginia. Let me see, Mill Point, West Virginia. It was a minimum security prison. And then it was segregated until December of 1951. Then he was transferred to a federal prison in Ashland, Kentucky, which is here. He got there, he was threatened with rape, and he thought a lot about it, and he thought that he would fight back. He was not going to take it without fighting back. And he had this experience, religious experience, he thinks, that this was just another test that God was giving him. And he decided that he would not fight back. He had been befriended by a big, powerfully built black man named Liberty. And once he made this decision that he would not fight back, the threat stopped. He was not raped, but he always thought it was Liberty.
Who made the threat?
Other inmates. He got, after a year and a half, he got out of prison, and the Methodist Church offered him a post in Nagpur, India. So you can imagine somebody who has read a lot about Gandhi. Gandhi, of course, is deceased at this time, but he loved to go to India. He was there for several years. All he wanted to do was learn about Gandhi. But he was with Christians, and they did not approve of Gandhi. But he did. He just loved him, and he thought that if Jesus had come back to earth in 1955, what different would he have said than what Gandhi had said? He also read about this man and the Montgomery bus boycott, enchanted with that and this idea of another person who believed in nonviolence. He then came back, went to Oberlin, and Professor Harvey Cox, did he later teach at Harvard? Is he a Harvard teacher?
Yes.
Divinity?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so he was at Oberlin at the time, and Martin Luther King was coming to lunch and speak, and so he invited James Lawson to be his guest to come. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been entitled to go. And Lawson got there early. Martin Luther King got there early. They started talking and realized they had this incredible connection, just believing all the same things, both nonviolent, reverence for Gandhi, and they were only 4 months apart in age. And he asked them about, please come to the South, and well, I'm going to, but I've got further studies and blah, blah, blah. And he said, you've got to come now. And he considered it a call from God, that he had to go. So he went to Nashville, and as we've already learned, he was fired by Vanderbilt after giving help to these sit-ins, Diane Nash and John Lewis, etc., Jim Bevel, and then is arrested. And here they are taking him out of church, and I love the sermon. Father, forgive them. He ends up accepting a position as pastor at Centenary Methodist Church in 1962. And on February 1, 1968, 6 years later, there's a bad storm in Memphis. These guys normally would stand on the outside of the truck, but because it was raining so hard, they didn't. They got inside, and there was a short circuit, and the masher came down and mashed them to death. Echo Cole and Robert Walker were their names. They had no death or survivor's benefits. They were unclassified workers, is what they were called. The mayor, in his generosity, said their family would get $500. Sanitation workers went out on strike. I think there were 1,100 of them, and I think 990 of them went out on strike. And this was their slogan: I am a man. And this went on for a long period of time, over a month. And then James Lawson and Martin Luther King at this time is planning this huge march for poverty. And they're going to march, as they had in 1963, they're going to march to Washington sometime in April or May. And he's planning for that and going around and raising money and talking about it. And he gets a call from Jim Lawson, and who asks him to come to help in Memphis, and he says he will. Probably the only person that Martin Luther King would do anything for. March 1 of 1968, the Kerner Report comes out. Our nation is moving towards two societies, one white, one black, separate and unequal. It's part of the Burnham Report. And one more. So there are other things that are going on at this time in 1968, which, as you all know, is a remarkable year. We all lived through that year. And this happened. So this is March 12, 1968. This is a New Hampshire primary. Notice how late it is now? Remember that somebody else put theirs before New Hampshire, then they moved theirs, and then somebody else moved theirs before. So is New Hampshire's got to be first. Now it's in early February. So Eugene McCarthy gets 42% of the vote, wins the New Hampshire primary against LBJ. 4 days later, seeing that result, Robert Kennedy enters the race. March 16. That same day, this is going on, half a world away. The slaughter at My Lai. Mostly women and children in that picture. There's a helicopter pilot, Hugh Thompson, sees the dead bodies, and he comes in and lands just as a pursuit squad from Charlie Company are heading to another 10 or 12 people huddling on the ground. Turns around, he tells his 18-year-old gunner, Larry Colburn, to shoot those army soldiers if they shoot at him or if they go any further toward these 12 people. 2 other helicopters land and take those 12 people to safety. As we know, not much was done about any of this. 30 years later, Thompson and Coleman are awarded the Soldier's Medal for Gallantry in 1998. Martin Luther King comes to Memphis on Monday, March 18, gives a speech to a huge crowd. This is before that date. And he says, "I'll be back." And he was going to come back on Thursday, the 21st. He's going to lead them on a march in Memphis. But this happened. 16 inches of snow in Memphis. I think it's the most they've ever gotten. So there's not going to be any march. And it's postponed to the 28th. He doesn't get back until about 10:30. The march was supposed to begin at 10. So everybody's kind of chomping at the bit and upset. He doesn't get to the parade, his place in the parade till 11 o'clock. They start off, they go 7 blocks, and all hell breaks loose because these kids are going and smashing windows, and for a nonviolent march, this is not what they wanted to happen. James Lawson tells them all there will be no more marching, and turns around and goes back to the church. So they're all very upset that that's how it ended up. But as you know, from 1965 to 1968, the civil rights movement had changed. And so there was a lot of violence. As the cities burning, et cetera, et cetera. But Martin Luther King and James Lawson still believed in nonviolence. And were not popular, not with the whites or with the blacks for this. March 31, so Martin Luther King promises to come back and they'll march again. March 31, this happened. I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination